Hello everyone. Today we are going to take a look at the human body. This is an introductory PowerPoint, so we are going to introduce some terms that you are going to use a whole lot in our human anatomy course. So it's basically an orientation PowerPoint. Alrighty, let's start with the level of structural organization of our human body. We're going to start with the smallest particles that we are made out of, and we're going to move our way up. So, a human organism, within our body, we have atoms. Atoms are, if you remember from your general chemistry, atoms are basically made out of protons and neutrons and electrons. So when you take a look at that periodic table um, of all of the elements, the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, nitrogen, etc., those elements, they're made out of protons and neutrons, and those are what we refer to as atoms. Now take a bunch of those atoms and put them together, and you create something that's a bit larger, which is a molecule. So a molecule is basically, for example, when you say water, H2O. So two hydrogens combined with one oxygen, that's a molecule. When you say CH4, so you've got one carbon bound to four hydrogens, and that's going to be methane gas. So CH4 is a molecule, and you can see that all of these molecules are made out of a bunch of elements that are bound together. Now, you find a bunch of those molecules within your organelles. Organelles, the meaning of the term organelle meaning small organ. And we have those small tiny organs inside of our cells. And we are going to discuss a bunch of these organelles later on. Examples of organelles, you have mitochondria, you've got your ribosomes, nucleus, etc. Those organelles have different functions, and you find them inside of your cells. We've got a bunch of different types of cells. For example, we have blood cells, we've got muscle cells, we've got bone cells. Each cell is going to have its own function, and each cell might have a bunch of different organelles compared to other cells located in a different region within your body. If you put a bunch of cells together, you create a tissue. So a tissue is basically a bunch of similar cells bunched up together. We've got, again, so many different types of tissue. If we look at this example right here, this is a smooth muscle tissue. Actually, our muscles, we have three different types of muscle tissues. We've got smooth muscles, we've got cardiac muscle tissue, and we've got skeletal muscle tissue. And when you look at them under the microscope, they are going to have unique features, which we will discuss when we go ahead and look at our histology and go over our histology PowerPoint. A bunch of tissues put together, we go ahead and we have an organ. So an organ is made up of at least two tissues or more. And those tissues could be different. So you can have one organ made up of several different types of tissue. Of course, when you think of organs, you think of things like your stomach, your intestines, your heart, but we don't really think of blood vessels as organs, but blood vessels are organs because they are made up of multiple different types of tissues. So they are considered an organ. So if you take a look at this image of a blood vessel, you would notice that it's made up of a type of tissue known as epithelial tissue. It's made up of muscle tissue, and it's made up of connective tissue. So as you can see, It's made up of different types of tissues, and therefore it is recognized as an organ. Now, a bunch of organs put together, and we start talking about our organ system. So when you think of organ system, for example, you think of the urinary system. So when you think of the urinary system, you think that my urinary system is made out of the kidneys, it's made out of the urinary bladder. When you think of the digestive system, you think of the stomach and the intestines. So you can see that a bunch of organs, they work together as a system, as one system. And one thing to note is that we have, of course, lots of organ systems like your digestive, your urinary, your respiratory. And all of these systems actually have to work together so that we can survive and we can as a human organism, function properly. If one system fails, then a bunch of other systems are going to start failing as well. So if someone gets, let's say, a heart attack, so their heart, their organ is failing, well, their cardiovascular system is going to start to fail, and therefore other systems and other organs are going to follow, and they're going to start shutting down. Some of the systems that we are going to look at this semester, we're going to talk about our skin. So the integument, that means skin. So we're going to talk about the layers of our skin and what it's made out of and how does your skin develop. We're going to talk about the glands, your oil glands, your sweat glands. We are definitely going to talk about the different types of muscles that we have in terms of tissues, and we're also going to talk about muscle names, and we're going to talk about how do they look like and what they do. Skeletal system, we're going to talk about how we develop bones. We're going to talk about, we're going to name and learn all of the bones within our body. We're going to talk about articulation and meaning how those bones are connected to each other. We are going to talk about our nervous system, which consists, of course, of our brain and our spinal cord and the nerves, and we're going to talk about the different parts of our brain. We are also going to talk about the endocrine system, which is all about the hormones that we produce. So we're going to talk a bit about those different hormones that we produce in our body. Cardiovascular, of course, the importance of cardiovascular. Your heart is to pump the blood to all of the organs in your body. So we're going to talk about the blood flow. We're going to talk about our heart and its chambers, etc. We're also going to discuss some of the blood vessels. Lymphatic system. Lymphatic system, it's actually a pretty important system that's usually goes hand in hand with your immune system. Your lymphatic system, you've probably heard about your lymph nodes, and you've probably heard about someone having swollen lymph nodes when they're sick. So your lymph nodes are basically like those nodules that you guys are seeing right here, and those nodules are filled with a bunch of white blood cells. And so because those lymph nodes are filled with white blood cells, those white blood cells are going to help you fight off infections. And that's why when someone is sick, their lymph nodes tend to get swollen because the white blood cells within them are actually fighting, and so inflammation can start taking place within them, and so that's why they would swell up. You can also see all of these vessels connected to your lymph nodes, and those vessels, you can also see that your lymphatic vessels, they drain into your veins. And so what happens is your veins and your arteries, so your blood vessels, of course, they contain blood, and blood contains water. So some of that water within your blood can actually start oozing out of your blood vessels. Now, if that water oozes out of your blood vessels and it just accumulates within your tissues, what's going to happen is we're going to swell up. And so therefore, the fluid that oozes out of your blood vessels, it enters into your lymphatic vessels. And then from there, your lymphatic vessels basically takes that fluid and drains it back eventually into your vascular system, so back into your veins. And so what happens is that in some individuals, if they go through surgery and some of their lymphatic vessels got damaged or they got removed, these individuals will tend to have swelling in that part of their body where the lymphatic vessels were taken out. We're also going to discuss the respiratory system, and so we're going to talk about the airflow, and we're going to talk about our lungs. Then we are going to discuss our digestive system, the organs that make up our digestive system, and we're going to talk about the accessory organs that are not really part of your GI tract, such as your liver and your gallbladder and what they do. Urinary system, we're going to talk about how we develop urine, which is basically the waste that we are going to release out of our body by filtering out our blood. Reproductive system, we're going to talk about the male reproductive parts and the female reproductive organs as well. So now let's move on to talking about our anatomical position and some directional terms that you guys need to know. So when we talk about our anatomical position, this is the anatomical position where a person would be standing straight, feet just slightly apart, your arms are down by your side, not like touching your trunk or anything, and then your palms would be facing forward. So right here, this is the anatomical position. Why is talking about anatomical position pretty important? Because as you can see, when someone is standing in an anatomical position, you can see that your thumbs are away, right? Your thumb is away from your body. Now, so if someone asks, is your thumb closer to your trunk or further away from your trunk? Based on this image, you would say that your thumbs are further away from your body trunk. But if someone is not thinking of an anatomical position, and you might think that, well, the thumb could be closer to my body if you flip your hand, correct? So to prevent confusion, how am I going to stand and if I'm going to think of my thumb as closer to my body or further away from my body, to prevent all of that confusion, they've decided that this is how you should think of when you are trying to decide which part is closer, is your thumb closer to your body? Is it further away? This is how you should think about it, the anatomical position. Now, the directional terms, we use those directional terms to basically help us out. Say this part of your body is closer, this part of your body is, let's say, closer to the trunk or closer to the point of origin. So we use specific terms. So let's go ahead and learn those terms together. So an example of two terms that we need to know is medial and lateral. So if you are thinking of the anatomical position, think of a line that's going to run down the middle of your body. So imagine a line basically splitting your body into two equal halves. This is going to, we're going to refer to it as the midline. Anything closer to the midline, we are going to refer to it as medial. Anything further away from the midline, we are going to refer to it as lateral. So, for example, let's think of an example together. Let's think of our clavicle, which is basically your collarbone, and let's say your shoulder. Okay, so you can see that your clavicle or your collarbone, it's closer to the midline compared to your shoulder. So I would say my clavicle is medial to my shoulder. Why? Because my clavicle is closer to the midline compared to my shoulder. I would say my shoulder is lateral to my clavicle. So my shoulder is a bit more lateral, right? It's a bit further away from the midline compared to my clavicle. So medial and lateral. One is closer to the midline. The other term means further away from the midline. Another two terms, proximal and distal. And proximal and distal, we usually use them when we are thinking about our limbs or your appendages. So basically your arms and your legs. We use the terms proximal and distal. Proximal coming from the word proximity. So proximity meaning close to. So proximal, that means closer to the point of origin or closer to your trunk, but I like to think of it as closer to the point of origin. Distal just means further away from the point of origin. So when you think of your, let's say, your arm, where would you say the point of origin of your arm is? Would you say the point of origin is like your shoulder, or would you say the point of origin of your arm is towards the wrist? So the arm, right? When you think of your arm and where is it starting from, you think that it's starting from your shoulder. So that would be your point of origin. So if I say your shoulder is what to your wrist, your shoulder is proximal to your wrist. Why? Because your shoulder is closer to the point of origin. So your shoulder is proximal compared to your wrist. Your wrist would be distal compared to your shoulder. For example, your wrist is what to your fingers. So your wrist is proximal compared to your fingers. Your fingers are further away compared to your wrist. So your fingers are distal compared to your wrist. Let's see, two more terms, superficial and deep. So you would say, for example, your skin is superficial to your muscles, right? Your muscles are deep to your skin. Some more directional terms. We've got front and back, but we don't say front and back. Instead, we say anterior and posterior. Another term for anterior that I want you to know is ventral, and another term for posterior is dorsal. So you would say that, let's say your belly, okay, is anterior to your back, right? So your belly is more towards the front compared to your back. Or you can say that your stomach is ventral compared to your spine. Okay, so ventral or anterior. So your back is posterior or dorsal compared to your stomach. Cranial meaning coming from the term cranium, and cranium is your brain. So your brain is up there. So whenever you use the term cranial, or you can use the term cephalic. Cephalic meaning head. So that means that you are pointing upwards, like you're pointing towards the head. So when you're using those terms, you are trying to say that you're pointing upwards towards the head. And then if you're trying to say you're pointing downwards, away from the head, you would use the term caudal. So you would say, for example, your hips, right? Your hips are caudal to your waist, right? Because your hips are further, down compared to your waist. So that's cranial cephalic versus caudal. So whenever you are pointing upwards, you would try to use the term cephalic. Further down, you would use the term caudal. Let's see. We talked about anterior and posterior. So this table right here kind of gives you more examples. So try it out, okay? Or try different, examples. So for example, if I say your nose is what to your mouth? So your nose is cranial, right? Because it's more upwards compared to your mouth. By the way, another two terms that you can use to refer to going towards the top is superior. And the bottom, you would say inferior. So we usually say, and those are the terms that we use a whole lot, superior and inferior. So I would say that my nose is superior to my mouth. My mouth is inferior to my nose. Your breastbone, or you can call it your sternum when we start learning the terms, the medical terms. So your breastbone is what to your spine? So your breastbone is anterior, right, compared to your spine. Your heart and your arm. So your heart is closer to the midline. So if my heart is closer to the midline, I would say my heart is medial to my arm. My arm is definitely lateral compared to my heart. If something is in between, we use the term intermediate. So inter means in between. So if you say your collarbone is what to your breastbone and your shoulder, so your collarbone is in between the two, right? So how do you say in between? We say intermediate. Your elbow is what to your wrist. So your elbow is closer to the point of origin if you're thinking of, again, your arm. So your elbow is definitely proximal compared to your wrist. If you're thinking of your knee and your thigh, your knee is going to be distal because your knee is further away from the point of origin of your leg, right? You think of the point of origin of your leg starting kind of from your thighs, from your hips, so therefore your knee is distal. Alrighty, some regional terms to also discuss is the term axial and appendicular. So axial, it's when you think of your head and your neck and your trunk, that's axial. Appendicular coming from the term appendages. So appendages are basically your limbs, like your arms and your legs, and your pelvis. That would be under the appendicular region. Those terms, we are eventually going to learn all of them when we start talking about all of these regions. So like your chest, for example, is your thoracic. When you see the term cervical, that would mean neck. Cephalic, we already talked about it, meaning head. So throughout the semester, we are going to, by the end of the semester, you are going to learn all of these terms. So when you think of femoral, that would mean thigh because it's like your femur bone is right there. When you think of olecranal, that would actually mean elbow. So we are going to eventually, as I said, learn all of these terms together. Now we are going to discuss sectional anatomy. So you know how when you look at an X-ray image, you might get different views of the same organ, and that's just because depending on how they cut it, you can view the same organ from basically different views. And so when we think of our body, we think of different planes. If you cut along those planes, you get different views. So we've got, let's talk about our sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane, if you cut along the sagittal plane, if you see this line right here, sagittal plane, if I cut down a sagittal plane, I'm basically going to get right and left. Now, remember how I said we can imagine that there is a midline splitting our body in half? So if I want to say that I'm going to cut down the midline, I'm going to say that I'm cutting down the mid-sagittal plane. So mid because you're cutting down the middle. And so if you cut down the middle, right in the middle, you're going to get, of course, two equal halves, a right half and a left, basically. But let's say you cut right here. You cut right down the shoulder. So if you cut right down the shoulder, you're still going to get right and left, but it's not going to be equal. So you say you're cutting down the parasagittal plane. And so parasagittal meaning that you're not going to get two equal sides. Or you could just say sagittal. So sagittal or parasagittal, that means that you're not going to get two equal halves. Mid-sagittal, you are getting two equal right and left parts of the body. This right here, the transverse plane, so if you cut along the transverse plane, you are basically, you can either call it, by the way, the transverse plane, or sometimes they refer to it as a cross section. So cross section or transverse section, it's the same thing. So if you cut along the transverse, you are going to get superior, meaning a top view, and an inferior view. So cutting along the transverse plane, you will get a superior and an inferior cuts or views. Frontal, if you cut frontal, you're going to basically get a front view and a back view. So basically you're going to get an anterior view and a posterior view. And you can either call it a frontal cut or you can call it coronal. Coronal meaning frontal. Oblique is when you're cutting at an angle, so that would be called an oblique cut. So if you look at this image right here, you can see the shoulders and arms of that individual. You can see their lungs, and so you're basically looking at a front view, right, of their body. So for you to see a front view, that means you've cut along the frontal plane. So this would be a frontal cut right here. This one, here is like someone's organs like the liver and the spleen, etc. And here's their vertebra. And it kind of seems like you're looking at them from the top, right? So kind of seems like you're looking at, you're basically looking at it that you are seeing a superior view. You're kind of standing up at the top and looking at it down. You're kind of looking down at their abdominal organs. And so if you're looking down at their basically trunk, that means that you have cut a cross section. So you've cut along the transverse plane. This one right here, you can see part of the individual's vertebra. You can see their anterior kind of view, and here is like their back. So it's kind of as if you're looking at them from a side view, or we can refer to it as a lateral view. And so for you to see a side view, right, which plane would give you side views? The sagittal. Um, Again, you can say sagittal or you can say mid-sagittal if you're going to get two equal halves. Another thing to discuss is our body cavities. So within our body, we have a bunch of different cavities, and usually those cavities are where you're going to have your organs. So your organs, they reside in these cavities to get protection. So we have dorsal and ventral, and by now we know that dorsal means back and ventral means front. So we've got some cavities towards our back and we've got some cavities towards our front. The cavities towards our back are the ones colored in yellowish or goldenish color. And those are your cranial cavity, where you're going to have your brain residing there. And you've also got your vertebral cavity, and that's where you're going to have your spinal cord. And as you can see, they're more towards the back, and that's why we refer to them as the dorsal body cavities. The ones in red are more towards the front, and so therefore we refer to them as the anterior or the ventral cavities. The ventral cavities, we divide them into several different cavities. So the chest region, we refer to it as thoracic. So right here, those we would refer to those cavities as our thoracic cavities. Now, if you think for a minute, what do we have in our chest? What organs do we have? Well, we've got our lungs and we've got our heart. Now, are your lungs and your heart sharing a cavity? Um, well, you can think of it as yes and no. Yes, in terms that they're all in the thoracic cavity, but no, because each one is going to be in its own separate cavity. So meaning that your lungs and your heart, they are within your thoracic cavity, but your lungs are found within a cavity known as the pleural cavity, and your heart is found within the pericardial cavity. By the way, the term peri in medical terminology means around, and cardial in medical terminology means the heart. So pericardial, it means the cavity like that surrounds your heart, around the heart. This middle region right here, by the way, in between your lungs is called the mediastinum region. Midi, kind of think of it as middle. So this is the mediastinum region where you have your pericardial cavity, and then surrounding you would have the pleural cavity. So you can see that the pericardial cavity is more medial if we, review a bit. So the pericardial cavity is medial to your pleural cavity. Underneath your thoracic cavity, we've got our abdominal and we've got our pelvic cavity. So what's separating your thoracic and your abdominal cavity is a diaphragm, which is a muscle. So the diaphragm muscle right here. Your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity, sometimes what they do is they combine the two terms by saying abdominopelvic. And so if you say abdominopelvic, that means you're talking about those two regions right here. Your abdominal cavity, this is where you have your digestive organs. Your pelvic cavity, this is where you have your urinary bladder. This is where you have your reproductive organs. Now, we said that your cavities are pretty important because this is where you're going to have your organs, and so the cavities are basically going to act as a protective space for those organs. Now, another thing that we have to protect our organs, it's a membrane known as the serous membrane, and the serous membrane, it's made up of it's really a one layer. So I know here it says double layer, but it's technically one, and that one layer folds around itself, kind of giving you the impression that it's made up of two layers. The layer that's going to be closest to the organ, we're going to call it visceral, because visceral means internal. And the layer that's going to be further away from the organ, we are going to refer to it as parietal. So what do I mean by it's one membrane and it kind of folds around the organ? So let's say that you guys have a balloon. Okay, so get a balloon and inflate it with air. Then what you want to do after you've inflated your balloon, take your fist and punch the balloon. So if you take your fist and you punch the balloon, part of the balloon, it's going to start encasing your wrist, correct? And then the rest of the balloon, it's going to be, it's not going to be touching your wrist, and it's going to be more towards the outside. So the balloon started out with one membrane, correct? And all you did was push your fist towards the balloon, or into the balloon. And so part of the balloon started to encase your hand. And so that's basically the serous membrane. Imagine your fist is basically an organ. So imagine your fist is your heart. And so basically you kind of take the heart and you push it into the balloon. So part of the balloon, you can see right here, it's going to start encasing your heart. And so we are going to refer to it as visceral. And then the rest of it, it's going to be further away from the heart, and we are going to refer to it as parietal. Now, visceral is going to be the one touching the organ, and parietal, as I said, it's going to be further away. Now, when you've done that, again, if you try it with the balloon, you're going to notice that there's air, right? Like, see how here there is air because the balloon was inflated with air? So there's air separating now the part of the balloon encasing your fist and part of the balloon that's outside. Same concept. With the serous membrane, there's actually a little bit of cavity. You can see it right here. And that cavity is usually filled with fluid. Now you might think, what's the point of having fluid between my visceral layer and my parietal layer? That fluid is actually going to prevent the rubbing of those two membranes against each other. So it's going to prevent friction. If you think of your heart is pumping blood 24/7. So your heart is beating 24/7. If you did not have any fluid in between those two layers and your heart is pumping 24/7, those two layers are going to start rubbing against each other, and it's going to be pretty painful. And so that's why it's important to have this cavity and to have that lubricant fluid in between the two layers. Now, how can I tell that this serous membrane is surrounding my heart and not my lungs? What we do is the terms parietal and visceral never change. It's what that comes after those two terms that will determine which organ are we talking about. So if I say pericardium, then I'm talking about the heart. So if I say visceral pericardium, that's the serous layer surrounding my heart. But if I say visceral pleura, that means it's the layer surrounding my lung. If I say parietal pericardium, again, that's the outer layer, kind of lining the cavity and further away from the organ. But if I say pericardium, then I'm definitely talking about the heart. If I say pleura, then I'm talking about the lung. So when you say pericardium, you are talking about the heart. Pleura, you're talking about the lungs. Peritoneum, it would be the serous layer that's surrounding some of your abdominal cavities. So here's the lung, and so one more time, surrounding the lung, you've got the visceral pleura layer, and then you get the cavity filled with fluid, and then you have the parietal pleura layer. Our abdominal pelvic cavity is such a large region, so to make it easier, especially let's say for surgeons that are going to open up a patient, they go ahead and they divide that abdominal cavity into 4 quadrants. The right and left upper quadrants and the right and lower quadrants. And this is the right because whenever we are whenever we are labeling right and left on the images, we are always thinking of the person in front of us. So don't think of your right and your left. Always think of the, for example, the patient in front of you. So that's their right side and that's their left side. But those four quadrants are pretty huge as well. So to make it even more precise, we go ahead and we divide those four quadrants into 9 regions that I want you guys to know. So those 9 regions that I want you guys to know are the following. So let's start with here. And if you break the word down and understand what the word means, it's going to make it easier for you to remember it. So this middle region right here, it's the umbilical region, and that's kind of pretty easy to remember because that's where we would have our umbilical cord. So this region right here, it's the umbilical region. Now above it, if you can see this organ right here, that's your stomach. That's the liver, by the way. But stomach is gastro. So whenever you see the word gastro, that means stomach. So epi, in medical terminology, it means above. Gastro means stomach. Whenever you see IC, like that suffix IC, it means pertaining to. So if we break the word epigastric, it means pertaining to the region above the stomach. And if you see this region, like here's the stomach, it is above the stomach. So that's why we call it epigastric, right here, above the stomach. Now, what about this region? Well, I am way below the stomach. So how do I say below the stomach? I am going to say hypo. So hypogastric means below the stomach. Right and left to the epigastric, we have right and left hypochondriac. So hypo means below, chondro in medical terminology means cartilage, and then AC also means pertaining to. So hypochondriac means pertaining to the region below the cartilage. Okay, why cartilage? Well, if we look right here, here are our ribs. The part that's connecting your ribs to your breastbone, these whitish parts, those are actually cartilage. So that's why we refer to it as hypochondriac, because you're kind of looking at this region that has a bunch of cartilage. And we have right and left. This region right here, it's your lumbar. Lumbar meaning your lower back. So when you think of your spine, we divide your spine into 3 regions. We've got cervical, which is going to be your neck up here. And then you've got thoracic, which is going to be your chest. And then you've got your lower back, which is your lumbar. Below your lower back, what do we have? Well, I have my hips, right? So your hips is iliac. And the reason why we refer to it as iliac, again, AC meaning pertaining to, and why ili? What's that? That's basically part of your hips. So part of your hips, we refer to it as ilium. And so that's why when we say iliac, we are referring to your hips, your pelvic region. So that's why, again, we've got right and left iliac region. So if you understand what the term means, it's going to make it easier for you to remember where it's at. So if you remember that iliac, it's hips, then I'm never going to say that my iliac is up here, right? And then try the directional terms. So if I ask you, what is your hypochondriac to your epigastric? Use directional terms. Well, do you guys see how your epigastric is closer to the midline? So your hypochondriac, it's lateral to your epigastric. Your epigastric is medial to your hypochondriac. What is your epigastric to your umbilical? Well, it's superior. So try using the directional terms to compare those 9 regions together. And that's just another image showing you all 9 regions. Make sure that you know their names. Make sure that, again, if I ask you to use directional terms to basically compare the location of those 9 regions, you are able to do so.